I'm seriously concerned that the major religions of the world do not distinguish between actual spiritual insights and doctrine. When I say actual spiritual insight, I am talking about something that we know is beyond subjective experience or interpretation and that accurately describes an actual paranormal phenomena. In comparison, we would not describe observations of mundane physical phenomena as a spiritual insight. Religion provides many things for people: a sense of purpose, meaning, a moral framework for how you should behave and what is expected of you, rituals for important events in your life like marriage, and finally beliefs that give us certainty and comfort about things that we find uncomfortable. We should not conflate any of these things with actual spiritual or paranormal insights, though. Many religious institutions have chosen to solidify beliefs into doctrines. This is understandable but unfortunate. There is no inherent requirement for deep spiritual or paranormal insight when contributing to or creating doctrine. Treating doctrine as if it was indistinguishable from spiritual insight is very damaging because people are not taught how to separate fact from fiction. Rejecting falsification and embracing faith concentrates human flaw and fallibility because the ability to correct mistakes is severely limited or non-existent. This is the opposite of a system that actually seeks truth and perfection. In other words, if you wish to pursue truth and perfection, you must abandon unfalsifiable faith because it is a contaminating, worldly, and non-transcendent element. It is quite common for religious people to claim that logic and science have inherent limitations that prevent you from seeing the truth of their religion or from having a relationship with the deity. This reflects the limits of the religion in question rather than the limits of science or logic, namely the religion's over-reliance on subjective experience and dogma. It doesn't occur to them that science has less limitations than religion does. Science can be used to find transcendent insights beyond the scope of a single limited religion. If we understand that religions generally fail to handle the easy subject of accurately describing the physical world, why would we expect them to do better when it comes to the harder subject of transcendent insights? Buddhism has the same issue that Abrahamic religions do because it is based off of both pure mythology and mythologized stories which were believed to be literally true. Yet Buddhism seems to be more open to fixing its shortcomings than Abrahamic religions, showing a greater intellectual honesty. The 14th Dalai Lama explained that, quote, empirical evidence should triumph over scriptural authority, no matter how deeply venerated a scripture may be. This shows remarkable humility because it demonstrates a perspective that is willing to let go of the most sacred texts if they are found to be empirically false. Essentially, it is acknowledging that beliefs in religious texts only have value if they hold empirical truth inside. It defies logic to assert that there is a perfect divine plan which rewards faith, considering the fact that faith can also lead to heresy. Faith by its very nature is belief without sufficient evidence, and when untethered from reason or falsifiability, anyone can adamantly believe in whatever far-fetched or incoherent idea they desire, as long as they portray faith as a valid justification for it. This explains the current situation we have now, in which all of the major world religions have significant doctrinal differences from each other and have failed to converge upon a single shared, singular spiritual insight. Major world religions have all converged upon the stance that you should not deviate from their doctrine because ideas that fall outside of the doctrine, generally speaking, are not supposed to have genuine spiritual insights. This all seems to have occurred because the major religions of the world all evolved before the idea of falsifiability really became popular. This is truly a significant, perhaps insurmountable problem because faith is a meta-principle that contributes to their success. Faith as a meta-principle, or the underlying framework that supports the function of religion, is in direct competition to the meta-principle of falsifiability that we use in every other aspect of our lives to determine if something is actually true or false. All major religions assert that they are factually true, yet all of them rely on faith. Faith alone can't determine whether or not doctrine holds actual spiritual insights. Only investigation and falsifiability can determine this kind of thing. Therefore, all major world religions are fundamentally unable to discern fact from fiction. It seems to be taken for granted that semi-mythological or outright mythological stories should be the basis of our understanding of spiritual insights. Actual spiritual insights do not absolutely need formal religious institutions and adherence to dogma to support them. They just need sufficient evidence and rigor. Now imagine if we stopped funding a priestly class, but instead we put our money towards meritocratic institutions devoted to finding and verifying spiritual insights. For example, this field of parapsychology uses scientific methods to learn more about paranormal phenomena. This performs the opposite role of affirming doctrine because doctrine seeks to stop new insights and alternative ideas because they undermine current ideas. Doctrine itself is a form of stagnation. To embrace doctrine is to embrace the fading illusion that people in positions of authority have unquestionable spiritual insights. A fundamental error that many people make is thinking of spirituality in terms of religion instead of in terms of objective facts which can be observed independent of tradition and personal belief. All major world religions are fundamentally based on tradition, and passing down beliefs is the core tradition consistent among all of them. If we were to stop and ask what is the value of this tradition of belief, each religion would give a different answer that is superficial in a sense because they are only thinking in terms of the individual religious framework. Superficial answers like these don't satisfy the question at a deeper level because part of the tradition is to only think in terms of the religious framework. The point of tradition is to ensure that values, practices, stories, etc. are passed from one generation to the next over and over again. Just like how people fail to distinguish between actual spiritual insights and doctrine, they also fail to realize that religious traditions are not synonymous with deeper insights. Most religious traditions only appear to have deep insights from within the religious framework itself. Outside the framework, the unbiased observer questions why they put so much meaning into such rituals when they could be concerned with more productive things. Let's operate under the understanding that a paranormal or transcendent mechanism exists as a brute fact of the universe. I would like to remind you of Clarke's third law: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. A modified form of this idea is appropriate to prove a point. Any sufficiently fundamental aspect of the universe is indistinguishable from the paranormal. This is based on the fact that our observable physical reality is derived from a mechanism which can alter it in a markedly different way than any purely physical mechanism. In fact, we already know that our modified Clarke's law is true, with Einstein's ridicule of quantum entanglement as spooky action at a distance. Furthermore, any scientifically rigorous evidence of an effect which appears to violate physical laws can be considered evidence of a more fundamental underlying mechanism. Treating the transcendent as a matter of personal belief would be to reduce the most important topic to the very lowest standard. The personal belief of the average person is based on very limited information and certainly contains flaws. It is often the case that personal belief is majorly influenced not by an unbiased assessment of the facts, but instead by what we have been raised to believe and what we like to be true. Personal belief in general is a very poor guide because our natural state is ignorance. We have to be taught how to do pretty much everything when we are children. Relying on personal belief alone is deeply flawed. If evidence that contradicts your belief can simply be dismissed, then you've effectively eliminated any possibility for non-intuitive facts to reshape your views. In short, you've destroyed falsifiability. Using personal belief as a guide for your understanding of the transcendent generally seems to be a choice made out of convenience rather than a desire to have an absolutely rigorous understanding of a greater truth. I was raised Roman Catholic, so my impression of faith was of an obligation to believe certain things because they were not only held to be true, but believing in them also made you more suitable for salvation in heaven. Faith was promoted as a virtue. However, Roman Catholicism is one of many, many perspectives that try to comprehend and make sense of the idea of the transcendent. My Roman Catholic upbringing just wasn't meant to meet the kind of high standard like the one that I believe we should be aiming towards. If I told you that since I was raised Roman Catholic and I absolutely insisted that Roman Catholicism is the one true perspective, based solely on the fact that my parents raised me that way, people would be right to point out how profoundly arrogant that perspective is. If I could perform miracles that align with my beliefs, then that would seem to imply at least one of two possibilities. Either the beliefs serve as a mental framework that allows me to perform miracles by unlocking latent ability, or the beliefs describe an external reality accurately enough that I can use this knowledge to manipulate reality. In the Christian context, it is believed that humans are indirectly manipulating reality, with God doing the heavy lifting. I frequently talk about the evidence that humans can paranormally influence reality without needing to have an external force, divine or otherwise, to do the heavy lifting. We can use Occam's razor to state that it is more likely that a specific paranormal effect originates from a human rather than an external divine or demonic force. This is because explanations that involve external, divine, or demonic forces require more assumptions to be true, and therefore are less likely to be true. Additionally, theories that involve demonic or divine forces fail to offer noticeably better explanations. My point is that it seems to be the case that some non-materialistic belief systems can act as a framework which allows you to manipulate reality through latent ability. In the video about telekinesis and Count de Gasperin, I explained that the evidence was clear that whatever mechanism that could paranormally move tables did not seem to have the ability to access knowledge that wasn't already known to the participants of the experiment. In this context, the spiritualistic belief that spirits were moving tables was factually incorrect, but the belief allowed the people to exercise their own paranormal influence. In other words, the ability to use paranormal influence like miracles does not prove that your beliefs about the paranormal are completely accurate. It only suggests that people who can perform miracles would be more valuable to interview than the average person who doesn't have that ability. As a side note, there is a major logical issue with the attempt to try to prove that a God exists through miracles. It presupposes the very point that it tries to prove. It's an example of circular reasoning. Miracles can never prove that a God actually exists because to identify something as a miracle within the Christian context, one must already believe that there is a God that could cause such a miracle. The argument then is that a God must exist because miracles happen. Miracles are defined in such a way that they could only come from a specific God. It's essentially defining a God into existence. It obviously does not mean someone has a greater insight into the transcendent if they behave in a manner uniquely obedient to a specific religious moral framework. Obedience is only proof of obedience. Furthermore, obedience in this context, in the strictest sense, is only obedience to the people who contributed to the creation of the religion. If you wish to claim that you are acting in line with a moral framework passed to humanity by a transcendent force, the burden of proof rests upon you to back up that claim. In comparison, if someone could repeatedly and deliberately perform paranormal actions, this would imply that they have a unique ability or unique knowledge about the transcendent. It is a serious problem to conflate obedience to a religious moral teaching with holding actual insights about the transcendent. It is demonstrably wrong and fallacious to hold that morality could only come from the transcendent as portrayed by various religions. The tradition common in Christianity is that people are allowed to become priests only when they demonstrate that they hold the knowledge and behavior suitable for the role. No miracles, not even very minor ones, are required. This illustrates how Christianity, as currently structured, does not enable the average priest to deliberately and directly engage with the transcendent. Since the priests can't deliberately and directly engage with the transcendent, and they don't have unbiased factual knowledge of the transcendent, they instead rely on perceived institutional authority. The knowledge that priests are given is not an unbiased, frequently updated understanding of the transcendent, but instead is a matter of what they hold to be true, independent of the hard evidence. It would make a lot more sense, to me at least, if you were running a religious organization to create a structure that teaches people how to perform miracles, or at least promote and incentivize the practice of miracle work. The reason things are run this way, of course, is mostly because of tradition and doctrine, but tradition and doctrine are obviously not giving results. This is only tolerable because no denomination of Christianity can really teach people the traits that would enable them to reliably work miracles. If there actually was a single denomination that could teach miracles, they would automatically outperform other denominations provided that Christians were rational actors. After doing some informal polling and questioning, it seems to me that many Christians are not rational actors because when they are given a hypothetical situation, they would rather keep their current beliefs instead of choosing to join a different Christian denomination that would teach them how to perform miracles. However, the Christians who are willing to have deeper conversations with me do act rationally. The reason for this is obvious. They are genuinely interested in the truth. They do not tie themselves to a narrow fixed perspective. They accept that we all have limitations on what we know, and this allows them to overcome ideas that would otherwise limit their ability to use reason. I understand the results of my polling may be difficult to believe, because I found it difficult to believe myself. but barriers against falsification that lie within Christian doctrine, as well as the difficulty of changing your long-held beliefs, seem to explain why certain Christians hold this position. It is for these reasons that I am definitely not convinced that Christianity is taught by any church represents the one true perspective about the transcendent. Similarly, I do not believe that Christian doctrine or simple faith can lead the average person to a greater understanding about the transcendent. If a person genuinely thinks that getting closer to God enables miracles to occur, yet they don't dedicate their life to this goal, then their actions do not match their thoughts. Obviously, they can't pursue that because they have practical concerns like working a job, so miracles are not certain like the necessity of making car payments. This shows you that faith in the benefits of pursuing miracles and devotion is inferior to the faith in the consequences of missing car payments. It is the difference between an abstract intellectual belief and behavior which reveals what they believe to be real in a concrete sense. We can apply the same distinction to a charismatic preacher who acts as if his concrete goal is to obtain as much money and fame as possible, while his abstract goal is to bring people to salvation. The preacher doesn't actually believe that salvation is important because amassing as much money as possible shows that he is concerned with the present and not the afterlife. If someone's actions do not embody what he intellectually holds to be true, then whether he realizes it or not, he is being dishonest to himself and everyone that he talks to about his stated beliefs. Many people are taught as children that there is only one perspective that is actually absolutely correct about the transcendent. Consequently, there isn't an immediate incentive to try to take an unbiased perspective and investigate independent of that starting point. I think it would be unfair to say that faith has no value whatsoever. It just needs to be put in a completely different context in order for it to have more value. I would define a productive faith as the belief that experimentation, pursuing evidence, and observing will lead you closer to the truth. People typically think of experimentation in a rigid sense, but you can try all sorts of open-minded experiments with the intent of finding deeper knowledge of the transcendent. People seem to forget that science is a tool for finding answers, and not just for discrediting ideas that conflict with the philosophical position of materialism. One of the things we might consider is the reason why college textbooks lose value so quickly. The reason why this happens is because new versions with minor changes are made frequently. Small changes are made often because we are constantly updating our understanding of the topic at hand. If we seriously value the transcendent at least as much as we value something like astrophysics, then it would obviously follow that our understanding of the transcendent would be updated at least as frequently as an astrophysics textbook. We clearly don't apply the same standards to every topic, and because of this, our understanding of the transcendent is largely relegated to the domain of individual belief and personal experience instead of being treated as a hard science like astrophysics, which can be demonstrated to be real and relevant regardless of your personal disbelief in it. The ultimate expression of faith in the transcendent for me is to act as if the transcendent was equally real and observable as the planets are. If someone doesn't think that the transcendent can actually be observed or understood in any meaningful, rigorous way, then this belief reveals a lack of faith that the transcendent is equally real as astrophysics. Additionally, if the transcendent is treated as if it can't be observed or understood in a meaningful or rigorous way, then the pursuit of the transcendent becomes a kind of self-defeating exercise, a fool's errand of trying to reach out and touch the intangible. Let's say we have a certain activity, whether it is superficially labeled as prayer, meditation, or sorcery. Additionally, let's say we can demonstrate this activity has actual paranormal influence on an object. We could choose to demonstrate that people can do this, and while that you personally haven't tried it, you could choose to have faith in it based on sufficient evidence that you also have a fundamental latent ability to replicate the result. Using measurable paranormal influence of material as a standard of confirming that a paranormal effect is taking place appears at the surface level to be a fundamental error. It seems like a scientist who wishes to find a soul under the microscope. Using a measurable effect on material as a standard of confirming that a paranormal effect is taking place appears superficially to be a fundamental error. It seems like a scientist who wishes to find a soul under the microscope. The alternative of choosing not to confirm a paranormal effect and instead embracing ambiguity allows for our understanding of the paranormal to be contaminated by subjective feelings, unfalsifiability, and wishful thinking. With falsifiability, we can show that there is a difference between a subjective feeling that an individual may have sometimes near a painting because of its unsettling depiction, and a painting that spontaneously moves a centimeter when there is no external physical influence affecting it. Falsifiability is one of the reasons I place a lot of value on telekinesis. I've made a few videos already talking about telekinesis, which is the ability for the mind to influence matter. This is important because telekinesis is something that produces measurable results. Therefore, specific paranormal claims like an individual's ability to perform telekinesis are falsifiable because they can be tested under controlled conditions, where results can confirm, weaken, or refute them based on empirical evidence. Evidence like the text I'm showing right now is a scientist's description of a man using paranormal influence to bend a piece of metal. This piece of metal is strong enough that the scientist can categorically state that it is beyond human strength to bend through muscle force alone. If you would like to read more evidence of telekinesis, I would highly encourage you to read the whole book yourself, because you will find that paranormal effects are definitely repeatable under controlled conditions. Carl Sagan famously said that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. People have interpreted this to mean that anything that they subjectively deem to be extraordinary or difficult to believe must meet a higher standard of evidence based on the principle that the claim is extraordinary. This is fundamentally a misunderstanding of Sagan's words. First of all, the context from Sagan's book, Braca's Brain, shows that Sagan is clearly on the side of holding extraordinary claims to the same standard as the rest of science. His position is not that we should combat all perspectives that smell of pseudoscience, but that we should investigate extraordinary claims and judge them on their merits. Extraordinary evidence in this context is not extraordinary in terms of the amount, but it is extraordinary because of its implications. The existence of strong beliefs about a topic, whether it is from the perspective of a religious fundamentalist or a materialist pseudo-skeptic, do not actually require the opposing side to provide an exceptionally high amount of evidence. The usage of Carl Sagan's words in this context is actually just a skillful use of rhetoric. Now, this tactic may be commonly used by materialists, but religious fundamentalists could use a similar version of it by arguing that it's so obvious that God created our universe that materialists must provide exceptional amounts of evidence which can't be biased by atheist assumptions. Both uses of this rhetoric are equally invalid. Additionally, the attempt to try to force an unreasonable standard of evidence on the opposition suggests a desire to prioritize rhetoric over an unbiased investigation of the truth. In other words, this is an intellectually dishonest tactic. I would like to provide an example to demonstrate this kind of misapplication of reason. Richard Wiseman is a pseudo-skeptic who accepted that extrasensory perception has already met the standards of evidence that are acceptable for normal claims, yet he believes that paranormal claims require higher standards of evidence. He illustrates his point by saying that you would probably want more evidence for the claim that a UFO just landed compared to the claim that there is a red car outside. Both of these claims actually require the same amount of evidence, though. All you have to do is go outside and investigate to see whether there really is a UFO or a red car. Similarly, the claim that there is a material effect requires the same amount of evidence as the claim that there is a paranormal effect. His example and his larger point simply illustrates an arbitrary double standard based on personal incredulity. Dismissing a claim as extraordinary because it defies your personal belief and demanding excessive proof as a result is simply the appeal to personal incredulity fallacy. Additionally, the specific use of the fallacy is portrayed as if people are somehow justified in being unreasonably skeptical when they otherwise wouldn't demand excessive proof in any other area. A person who makes a claim is only required by the burden of proof to give sufficient evidence to support their claim. To claim that it's impossible to prove anything beyond simple materialism is at best misleading, because there is no evidence to justify such a conclusion. Not only is it a position that is incompatible with a major scientific principle because of its inherent unfalsifiability, but a person can never meet the burden of proof for that claim that the paranormal doesn't exist. Eliminating the ability to falsify the philosophical position of materialism is sacrificing a core aspect of the scientific process. The average materialist would not tolerate this rhetorical tactic if a religious fundamentalist was doing the same thing. This exposes a significant double standard and demonstrates that the argument is fundamentally hypocritical and lacking intellectual honesty. Finally, telekinesis can also be practiced in the comfort of your own home as a spiritual practice without the need for rigid adherence to dogma, outdated moral frameworks, or what I would call a kind of unwarranted faith. This kind of faith is held in spite of compelling evidence that the belief is fundamentally incorrect.